One of the first things you need to learn when working with AngularJS is its method for data binding. Data binding is how we display data within the view and vice versa. So updates within the view will communicate data changes back to, say, our model. So I'm going to create a new file here, paste in some HTML. We'll just call this index. And here, the only thing you need to use to get Angular working is a script tag, which I'll use here and put at the bottom of my body. It's very straightforward. It's hosted on the Google CDN, so you don't have to worry much about it. Now, obviously, since it is on the Google CDN, if you're going to be working, say, offline without internet access, you'll need your own local copy. But for this, we'll assume we're online. The next step we need to do is we need to create a div, and this is where we will host what we call our ng app, which is the scope of the overall Angular application. So I'm going to create an ng app tag here, and for now I'm just going to leave the name of it alone. So that defines the scope of our application. Everything within this div tag will be considered part of our ng application. Now, the most simple data binding that we can do is it's defined by bracket bracket, and let's say I just do 2 times 4, and that'll show us hopefully the multiple of 2 times 4. So let me just bring that up in the browser here. And that'll run it. And now it'll evaluate any JavaScript expression that you put inside the double curly braces. Now, for real applications, you're not going to be evaluating expressions live like this. You want to encapsulate the functionality that you want within a controller object that will perform all the functionality and is also testable, maintains separation of concerns, and does not leave logic within your view templates. So you can consider anything that's within that ng app tagged div to be elements of the view of the application. So to properly separate our concerns, we'll need to create a controller to use with our view. So I'm going to create a new file again, and this I'm going to call first controller. And we're going to put our controller code within this file so that we can encapsulate our calculation within this function. So I'm going to create a first controller object. It's going to take one parameter of scope, $scope, and we'll go through scope later and understand what that is. And here I am going to create a function that could be used within our view on that scope object. And I'm going to call it calc. And I'm going to create a function that just returns our 2 times 4 expression now, just to simply, oops, wrong brackets, return that value back to the view so that we can see how creating this this view controller will work. So I'm going to save that. Now we have to go back to our HTML file, and in here, in our div, along with our ng app, now it doesn't have to be on the same div. This could be another div inside of the ng app. But for now, I'm going to say ng controller equals, and I'm going to say first controller. And that's going to be the name of the object that we created in our first controller.js file. And then also, we don't want to forget including first controller JS in our list of scripts. And this way, Angular will know, okay, I need to look for this controller in this first controller.js file, or really just within the overall global scope of JavaScript. And then what we can do here is we can replace this 2 times 4 now with calc, our expression, which is a function now on our controller that will evaluate that. Now, we didn't talk about what this funny $scope variable is. So when Angular instantiates a controller, it passes what's called the scope to that controller. And that's represented by this $scope variable. You could think of the scope as the scope of the element that you're attaching this controller to, and it will contain links to all the Angular defined objects on the view. So $scope is how you communicate primarily between the first controller and the view. And then vice versa, the view, when these expressions like our expression calc here are evaluated, it will then look in the $scope of our controller and execute that function. And here we can see that's why we define this as $scope.calc and then define our function. And that's really how everything gets wired together. So let's do that. We'll go back to our function here. Let me bring up Chrome. I'm going to reload that. And there, now it has loaded our first controller, and it is now evaluating the calc function which exists on our first controller. And as a result, we get 8. So now, if you wanted to test things or write unit tests, you can now just test this simple controller function object that we've created that will now contain the methods and any data storage that we want to have in relation to the view. And you can now test this without having to have a DOM available to you, things like that. And that makes for a very flexible application, provides reuse possibilities, and properly separates all of your concerns within your application.